I invite you to light your own chalice or candle at this time. This time is sacred because we make it so. As we light this flame, we come together to celebrate life's mysteries and to honor the divine spark of transcendent light within each of us. Let us recite our affirmation together or listen and receive. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve the world in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we worship together.
Have you ever been so absorbed in a book or a story that you were carried into another world? Well, this morning in our Time for All Ages, to coincide with our theme, our monthly theme of imagination, I'm going to give you a flavor of one of the first books which did this for me when I was young. The book is called The Phantom Tollbooth, written by Norman Juster and illustrated by Jules Feiffer. Anyone familiar with this title? This is the book. There was once a boy named Milo who didn't know what to do with himself. Not just sometimes, but always. When he was in school, he longed to be out, and when he was out, he longed to be in. Wherever he was, he wished he was somewhere else. Nothing really interested him, least of all the things that should have. He says, "It seems that almost everything is a waste of time. I can't see the point of learning to solve useless problems, subtracting turnips from turnips, or knowing where Ethiopia is, or how to spell February." He looked glumly at all the things he owned: unread books, unused tools, unplayed with toys, and a small, very dusty electric car. Then, to one side of the room, oh my gosh, he noticed something different. He noticed an enormous package, and attached to the ribbon was a blue envelope, which said, "For Milo, who has plenty of time." The package contained one genuine toll booth, signs, assorted coins, a map, and a book of rules and traffic regulations. He unpacked, assembled the toll booth, and set it on its stand, where it looked like any other toll booth he'd seen on a family trip, but much smaller. He took a big cloth and dusted off his car, took the map, and for lack of anything better to do, set off for lands beyond. First stop, Dictionopolis. Never heard of it. He didn't know where that there was any such place, and thought to himself, "I hope this game is fun, or else my afternoon will be terribly dull." So he finds himself driving down an unfamiliar highway. He looks behind him to see that there is no toll booth, no bedroom, no house. So after driving through a place called Expectations and speaking to a confusing being called the Weatherman, spelled Whether, he begins daydreaming and makes a wrong turn turn ending up in a place called the doldrums, which is a place where nothing happens and nothing changes. Everything is gray and monotonous, and Milo meets the lethargians who live in the doldrums and who try to convince him that thinking is against the law. Suddenly, he hears a ruff, and a very large dog appeared. Everything about this dog was perfectly normal, except his body contained a loudly ticking clock. Tick, tick, tick. The watchdog, shouted the lethargians as they disappeared. Milo explains to the watchdog how he ended up in the doldrums by killing time. And that was the wrong thing to say. The dog was furious and his alarm goes off loudly. Ring. And then he asks Milo if he knows where he's going. And Milo tells the dog he was on his way to Dictionopolis when he stopped paying attention to where he was going. Well, said the dog, since you got here by not thinking, it seems reasonable that in order to get out, you must start thinking again. Although the dog ticks loudly, ironically, he says, you may call me Talk. And then the dog jumps in the car and says, I love automobile rides, and I'm sure we'll be great friends for the rest of the trip. The little car started up, and it started to go faster and faster as Milo's brain whirled with activity, and down the road they went. All the colors returned to their natural brightness as they raced along, and Milo continued to think of all sorts of things, including how much can be accomplished with just a little thought. As you may have figured out by now, this story is an allegory, a parable, and it delights in puns and wordplay throughout the book, which is really great. When we move farther along into the story, it turns out that the original king established a city called Wisdom, and with his advisors, who were named Rhyme and Reason. When this king dies, his two sons, who by nature were very suspicious and jealous, feud constantly, and the kingdom divides into two warring factions, one favoring words and the other numbers. Milo, Talk, and their new friend Humbug go on a hero's journey for most of the rest of the book. Here's a picture of Milo, Humbug, and Talk. Now, you can't see it all that well, but Jules Pfeiffer's illustrations are amazing. And I'm not going to tell you anything else about the books. And if you haven't read it, you can read it yourself or have it read to you. Thank you so much.
Every week, we lift up the spiritual value of generosity by taking an offering for the ministries of this church. Our virtual plate then becomes filled with the evidence of that generosity. It is our harvest, gathered in every week for what most nourishes us. You are invited to give as generously and joyfully as you are willing and able. If you are visiting with us today for the first time, we welcome you as our guest. If you'd like to contribute, you can mail a check made out to UUP to Marlene Abel at 133 Maria Drive, Petaluma, California, 94954. You can also go to our website, uupetaluma.org, and click the button on the top right that says Give. You can make a one-time donation, or you can set up a monthly recurring donation. For those donations, please recite with me our unison response. For the great gift of life and our many blessings, and for the generosity that sustains this religious community, and blesses our world, we offer our thanks.
Let us now move into 3 minutes of quiet meditation, prayer, and reflection, beginning and ending with the sound of the singing bowl.
So, while preparing for this service, I relish the idea of being able to talk about the imagination and how reading fiction in particular can foster and stimulate the freedom of that imagination and help us to integrate real life situations in which we find ourselves. My MO is to alternate between regular fiction and genre fiction. To be honest, more than half of what I read is written for young adults. I'll be mentioning a few authors who you may or may not have heard of, and I apologize for that. And I will put them and perhaps other favorites in the chat at the end of my talk, if you like. As a child, I longed to escape my real life without knowing that's what I wanted to do. Like many of you, I learned to read early in my childhood, and I quickly also learned that reading could set me free like nothing else in my young life. I sought solace in other worlds, comic books, many books about horses like Black Beauty, fairy tales, The Wizard of Oz. When I was too young to read, yet, I was listening to the Sunday comics on the radio. Any book also that anyone would read to me. And as I mentioned earlier, I learned to read quite young and quite on my own as a kind of a defense mechanism, as a strategy to shield myself from family squabbles and the violent temper tantrums of my older brother, among other things. Also because I loved it. Again, probably like many of you. Reading has always been my portal to daydream myself into other worlds, a portal to my imagination. TV programs or movies have their place, but with them, I lose whole chunks of time. And it's so easy these days to binge watch. Nothing against that, it's just not the best thing for me. But it's perfect for a pandemic, right? Again, for me, not really, because with everything else challenging Americans right now, and I totally acknowledge that, it's insane and crazy. I'm feeling a sense of renewed responsibility to stay here, to stay present. It takes discipline for me not to tune out. And I believe during this pandemic, also, I traveled back to my childhood in a sense, because during the first few months of the pandemic, I had broken my leg and ankle, and I was laid up for months. And so fiction was my way to go. Here are a few heartfelt quotes that really describe my point of view. Here's Neil Gaiman, from American Gods. Fiction allows us to slide into these other heads, these other places, and look out through other eyes. And then in the tale, we stop before we die, or we die vicariously and unharmed. And in the world beyond the tale, we turn the page or close the book, and then we resume our lives. Here's P.J. O'Brien, author of the Sanctuary series. Books are portals for the imagination, whether one is reading or writing. Writing something that no one is likely to read is like trying to have a conversation when you're all alone. Readers enhance the writer's created work, and they deepen the colors of it with their own imagination and life experiences. Here's from Margaret Atwood from her book In Other Worlds, and I love this book. Fiction has always laid claim to a certain kind of truth, the truth about human nature under observable social conditions. The true fiction novel contains fleshed out characters in real life situations, and any other that doesn't fit this category is called genre fiction. Genres, it is thought, have designs on us. They want to entertain as opposed to rubbing our noses in the daily grit produced by the daily grind. Unhappily for realistic novelists, the larger reading public likes to be entertained. I definitely like to be entertained. Ursula Le Guin describes scientific fiction as speculative fiction. And this was in a conversation that was between Ursula Le Guin and Margaret Atwood. She says that science fiction is defined as speculative fiction, and that's about things that could really happen, whereas things that could not happen, she classifies under fantasy. So my interpretation of what all these authors are saying, after all my research into the many authors whose books I've read and studied over the years, that is that every author has a different take on the definition of genre fiction. And in my opinion, the story they have to tell is much more important than its classification. Here's another one from Margaret Atwood. Surely, and this emphasizes my point that I just made, surely all draw from the same deep well, those imagined other worlds located somewhere apart from every day, one every day in another time, in another dimension, through a doorway into the spirit world, or on the other side of a threshold that divides the known from the unknown. Again, one from Neil Gaiman. Fiction can show you a different world. It can take you somewhere you've never been. Once you've visited these other worlds, it's like those who ate fairy fruit. You can never be entirely content with the world that you grew up in. Discontent is considered a good thing. Discontented people can modify and improve their own worlds, leave them better, leave them different. So what do I look like? What do I look like? I'm sorry. What do I look for when I'm searching to shake off the world for a while and slip into another? Well, personally, I have a penchant for myths, legends, and folktales from cultures all over the world. And these stories originated from attempts we humans had to try and answer big questions like, where did the world come from? Where did people come from? And what is right or ethical behavior? Or what happens when we die? As an elementary school teacher, way back when, before I was retired and on, I would culminate our 6th grade study of ancient civilizations like the Egyptians or the ancient Greeks with my students creating their own worlds from start to finish, top to bottom. Replete with their own creation story. They would draw their own maps, create customs for people, create their own who or what populated these worlds, religions, if they felt religions were needed, healthcare, governmental structure, and many et ceteras. And I told them the more details, the better. Be creative. And from all that they learned, they had the best time. We all had the best time. Okay, so I'm just going to give a nod to Star Trek. Yes, I am a nerdy Trekkie, but this nod has, even though Star Trek was a TV program, it says a lot. And this is something I've always felt more about the spin-offs than the original series. And this is from Nichelle Nichols, who was in the series, the first series, Beyond Uhuru, Star Trek and Other Memories. Star Trek did not promise that people would magically become inherently better, but that they would progress. It was an attempt to say that humanity will reach maturity and wisdom on the day that it begins, not just to tolerate, but to take a special delight in differences in ideas and differences in life forms. The ultimate futility, she says, of armed conflict, she says, the ultimate futility of armed conflict, terrorism, dictatorial rule, prejudice, disregard for the environment, and exercising power for its own sake. Did I say enough here? It has been demonstrated in our real planet, in our real country, time and time again, its ultimate futility. Reading genre fiction like science fiction, fantasy, or dystopian literature in which young people go on their hero's journey to fix the broken world, it gives me hope for the future, to dream a better world here on Earth, to let my imagination explore itself, to run free, which is why I keep diving in.
All of the worship services this month have been inspired by the theme of imagination. This has been especially relevant given how much we long for our personal lives, our community, and our nation to be free of the pandemic, the political chaos of the former president and his minions running roughshod over the norms of civility, tearing down social and environmental protections, inciting hatred and scapegoatism for political gain, and to finally fabricating election fraud claims to incite an insurrection. For example, the pandemic has shown the cracks in our for-profit health insurance system, making it crystal clear that the US healthcare system is terribly inadequate. Because when anyone is not able to afford medical care during a pandemic, everyone is put at greater risk of illness and spreading the contagious disease. With every part of the earth connected by air travelers, we are discovering this applies to everyone on our planet, Mother Gaia. My imagination dreams of a world where healthy countries provide vaccinations for absolutely everyone in our nation and the world. In this way of imagining, even universal health care, sometimes called Medicare for all, becomes a goal. Reverend Dara referred to Walter Brueggemann a couple of Sundays ago, a religious scholar who counsels us that the real purpose of prophetic imagination is to criticize the current political and extractive economic status quo while energizing us to imagine a new reality based on our values. Imagining a better future for our society and humanity's relationship to our Mother Gaia is difficult because those of us of privilege, most comfortable with the way things are, big changes threaten our comfort and convenience. Albert Einstein said, "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." To examine the blinders of us folks of privilege, I found the following in Motivation and Personality by Abraham Maslow. We tend to take for granted the blessings we have already have, especially if we don't have to work or struggle for them. The food, security, love, admiration, the freedom that have always been there, that I have never been lacking or yearned for, tend not to only be unnoticed, but also even to be devalued or mocked or destroyed. The phenomenon of failing to count one's blessings is, of course, not realistic, and therefore can be considered a form of pathology. In most instances, it is cured very easily, simply by experiencing appropriate deprivation or lack, such as hunger, loneliness, rejection, or justice. In no other way can we make sense of the puzzling way in which affluence, economic and psychological, can make possible either growth to lofty levels of human nature or the various forms of pathology. It is difficult, requiring constant vigilance and hard work for an individual to live more environmentally responsible when their culture offers seductive convenience without regard for the earth. Business as usual in our family lives, school and work dominate. Those that resist are often dismissed as naive. Many of us are trying to make sense of the political chaos caused by our former president and his minions so that we may imagine a way forward. Luckily, the former president's insurrection failed, but his influence is still strong. Given our UU fifth principle, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and society at large, I have looked for psychological analysis. The following are some quotes from a scientificamerican.com article, "The Shared Psychosis of Donald Trump and His Loyalists." Forensics forensic psychiatrist Brandy X. Lee explains the outgoing president's pathological appeal and how to wean people from it. Where does the hatred some Trump supporters display come from? There is an important psychological injury that arises from relative, not absolute, social economic deprivation. Yes, there is great injury, anger, and redirectable energy for hatred, which Trump harnessed and stoked for his manipulation and use. The emotional bonds he has created facilitate shared psychosis at a massive scale. It is a natural consequence of the conditions we have set up. For healing, he recommends fixing the economic conditions that give rise to poor collective mental health in the first place. Ken Wilber says in his book, Trump and the Post-Truth World, the cultural belief that everybody is created equal, that all people have a perfect and equal right to full personal empowerment, that nobody is intrinsically superior to anybody else. Yet, the overwhelming reality was increasingly one of a stark and rapidly growing inequality in terms of income and overall worth, property ownership, employment opportunity, healthcare access, and life satisfaction issues. The culture was constantly telling us one thing, and the realities of society were consistently failing to deliver it. The culture was lying. A culture that is consistently lying to its members simply cannot move forward for long. In an anxiety to authoritarianism in Yes Magazine, Zach Norris says, the human flight or fight response gives demagogues like Trump a tool for political manipulation. But we have a choice and could replace oppression with a system of care. Threats, both real and imagined, can be used to manipulate us. It turns out that invoking safety, which inevitably means invoking threats to our safety, is an effective way to trigger automatic, irrational anxiety responses. The mere whiff of danger whips people up into a state of panic and sends us into an automatic fight or flight response because our brains are finely tuned threat detection devices. This makes us super susceptible to inflammatory rhetoric that magnifies uncertainties, risks, and threats. Politicians, journalists, advocacy groups, marketers continue to blow dangers out of proportions for votes, ratings, donations, and profits, writes Barry Glassner, the sociologist whose 1999 bestseller, The Culture of Fear, has been reprinted and updated for the Donald Trump era. When people in power trigger anxieties and then promise a plan for safety, many are likely to embrace that plan no matter the consequences. Connecting the dots between capitalism, inequality, and the politics of hatred, the economist Umar Haig writes, what do people do as hardship begins to bite? Especially those who expected comfortable, easy lives. They become reactionary, lashing out violently. They seek safety in the arms of demagogues. It's the once prosperous, but now imploded middle, which turns on the classes, ethnicities, groups below it. People who expected and felt entitled to lives of safety and security and stability, who anticipated being at the top of a tidy little hierarchy, the boss of this or that, the chieftain of that or this, but now find themselves adrift and unmoored in a collapsing society, powerless. They turn to those who promise them just that superiority by turning on those below them, supremacy and dominion over the weak, the despised, and the impure. As John A. Powell, legal scholar and author of Racing to Justice, notes, when a person embraces the concept of supremacy, then equality is viewed as an attack. They believe this country belongs to whites. They believe that having people of color in positions of respect and power is un-American. There has been no greater example of a threat to their belief system than President Obama. It was not Obama's policies they objected to, but his humanity. Powell has written extensively about what he calls othering, a systemic exclusion, and the rise of ethnic nationalist and authoritarian politics. How do major societal events affect our worldview, the consciousness of the individual and society? Ralph Metzner says in his book, Ecology of Consciousness, The Alchemy of Personal, Collective, and Planetary Transformation. A culture of consciousness expansion, initiated in the late 40s and flowering in the 60s, led to profoundly healing and radical transformations in key areas of society over the next half century. The momentum of consciousness expansion triggered reactions of fear and resistance in those segments of society afraid of radical change. The academic and political guardians of the existing order, those who might stand to lose privileged status and wealth, reacted with panic and condemnation to the newly discovered means and initiatives for expanding consciousness. Gus Speth, a scientist and former director, Council on Environmental Quality, says, I used to think the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. But I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists do not know how to do that. To guide us, we have our seventh principle, the respect for the interdependent web of all existence, which we are a part. This quote is from the introduction to Choosing Earth, Humanity's Great Transition to a Mature Planetary Civilization by Duane Elgin. The author says, reaching the limits to growth is recurring and predictable development throughout nature. Most species commonly seek to exploit their ecological niche to the fullest. Humanity's niche or operating domain is now the entire Earth, and we are exploiting it to the extreme. We should not be surprised if a great tragedy is necessary to awaken the evolutionary intelligence of humanity. Suffering is the fire that can awaken our compassion and fuse humanity into a cohesive world civilization. Could the enormity of loss be the catalyst for an unimagined gain? How do we UUs imagine a better society using principle number 1, the inherent worth and dignity of every person? And number 2, justice, equity, and the compassion in human relations. Hope, but that it has been done. I will read a quote from the local library abstract of Rutger Bregman's book, Humankind, A Hopeful History. Human beings, we're taught, are by nature selfish and governed by self-interest. It is a belief that unites the left and right, psychologists and philosophers, writers and historians. It drives the headlines that surround us and the laws that touch our lives. Humankind makes a new argument and gives powerful examples that it is realistic as well as revolutionary, to assume the instinct to cooperate rather than compete, trust rather than distrust, has an evolutionary basis going back to the beginnings of Homo sapiens. By thinking the worst of others, we bring out the worst in our politics and economics. Bregman shows how believing in human kindness and altruism can be a new way to think and act as the foundation for achieving a true change in our society. It is time for a new view of human nature. Roger Bregman rocked the world by telling rich people at Davos that they need to pay more taxes. The subversive idea that breaks economics. What if humans are fundamentally decent? As Mahatma Gandhi cautioned, Earth provides enough to satisfy every person's needs, but not every man's greed. I was inspired by Izzy Fisher, a college student member of UU Santa Rosa and an NBOP activist, during her reflection during their worship January 17th. She quoted from a TED Talk by Angela Ongantala. When we think about futures, we possess both hope and fear. Yet we often forget we also have the power to influence. We can choose futures and can work towards them by choosing to be curious about the alternatives and taking them seriously. We can start to think and solve problems in new ways, and we can start to see possibilities where we could not see them before. We need to develop new stories, perhaps even thinking like a child, to have enough imagination to envision a dramatically better world. This past week, in the breakout rooms of the New Republic of the Heart, we played a children's game of taking turns creating a story. In my group, the story was some neighborhood children went to play in a nearby woods. It got scary when a big mama bear appeared and approached the children. The kids were too scared to run and were afraid to say no when the bear asked for them to share their picnic lunch. The bear was disappointed when the kids had no fruit to share, but offered to show them her favorite place to eat berries. To make the long story short, eventually the whole town learned how to gather food in the woods from what the bear taught the kids. The town purchased the land, put it into a land trust for everyone to share, becoming something like our Petaluma Bounty. People realized they could feed their families this way, working together, needing to spend less time commuting to the city working for corporations. The food forest land trust idea spread around the world, funded by US and other wealthy countries. Military funds moved to a new Department of Sharing the Commons, and world hunger was a thing of the past. Here are some closing quotes that give me hope that we may imagine a better future. Mahatma Gandhi says, "Live simply so that others may simply live." Thomas Merton says, "You do not need to know precisely what is happening or exactly where it is all going. What you need is to recognize the possibilities and challenges offered by the present moment and to embrace them with courage, faith, and hope." Sarah Lazarevich of the Minimum Viable Planet newsletter says, we need to visualize what a sustainable, decarbonized world looks like if we are going to get people excited about climate action. And if the virility of the lovely poet Amanda Gorman tells us anything, it is that we have been starved of beautiful inspiration these past few years. Quoting Kendra Pierre, once upon a time, some humans told a story about their relationship to the earth, and they used it to build a world that was beautiful but flawed. Over time, people realized that it was the wrong story, and they constructed a new one that said they can live in harmony with their environment, and they used the pieces of their old story to construct their new one. Arundhati Roy says, the pandemic is a portal. May the portal take us to the most just and sharing culture we can imagine in our best dreams. May it be so.